Welcome to another program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I'm delighted tonight to introduce you to author Tom Mcmillan. Tom, some of you may know from his Civil War books on Armistead and Hancock and on 5 Gettysburg Rebels. Tonight, though, he is talking about his very first book, which was Flight 93. Tom became interested in this subject while he was still working as a sports journalist. He has a long career as a writer, talk show host, and vice president of communications with the Pittsburgh Penguins hockey team. But he became interested in Flight 93 and served on the board of trustees and also worked as a volunteer at the site. Tonight he's going to share the research he did into learning more details of the story of the participants in that heroic effort to stop an act of terrorism. So I'm turning the program over to a very lively and passionate history researcher and wonderful speaker, Mr. Tom Mcmillan.
Flight 93 was my first book. It was learning the process, but also a very emotional project, as you can imagine. But one thing that I learned that I didn't expect was that there's a unique challenge to writing contemporary history. Most history we think of being 100 years ago, 200 years ago. My other books on the Civil War, when nobody's alive who remembers those days. Here it's different, where people experience it, they remember, they consume the media. And therefore, as an author, you have kind of the battle between history and memory. History being what happened, and memory being, I thought I read this in the New York Times. I thought I saw this on CNN, or even worse, I read this on the internet. On top of that, you're dealing with the fact that we all, as humans, have short attention spans. And if you're like me, September 11th happened. I consumed everything for about a week, maybe 10 days. A week to 10 days, I think, everything that was written or shown, I watched. But then we have to get on with the rest of our lives. And we're not paying as close attention. And a lot of our images, a lot of what I found doing this, a lot of people's memories of their vision of the story of September 11th or Flight 93 is what they heard in that first week to 10 days. And I know from back in journalism school in Pittsburgh back in the 1970s, they would teach us, and it makes sense. Often early in crisis or tragedies, the early reporting is often flawed. There are some incorrect things that get out there. This isn't part of the fake news thing. This is just, even the authorities don't know what's happened yet. So the reporters are fumbling around doing the best they can, and things get out there. And I do think a lot of people have those images from those early reports. They were corrected, but sometimes it took weeks or months or years. So as a writer, you're dealing with that. I'll just start with a couple of those. Too little and one kind of that overrides the story. One is that the hijackers attacked with box cutters. Widely reported, in the 20th anniversary, you could see that everywhere. People think that. I used to think, I wouldn't want to get cut with a box cutter, but I found it hard to believe these guys hijacked 4 planes just using box cutters. And it turns out that they didn't. The FBI found at least 14 receipts for knives. These guys, the hijackers, had researched our system. They knew it is better than some of us. They knew, as certainly I didn't on September 11th, 2001, that it was legal to carry a knife blade of up to 4 inches on a plane. So they went to stores like Lowe's and Home Depot, and they bought multi-purpose tools, Leatherman wave tools. You can still buy them, 10 or 12 blades. And people say, how'd they get them on the plane? They put them in their pockets and walked on the plane. It was very legal. So they used knives as part of their weapons. The other is that the passengers and crew called from cell phones. Widely reported, they went to their cell phones and made calls. I saw that in a video not long ago. And it led to, obviously, conspiracy theories. You can't make cell phone calls from 35,000 feet. Well, the reality is, there's one famous call from Flight 93. There were 37 calls made from Flight 93. 2 of them were from cell phones, very late in the flight when the plane was low. 35 of them came from airphones. We'll show an image a little later. These were, young people don't know what these are. They're video screens now, but there were seat back airphones, 1 for every 3 seats. You may recall them. You could pull them out, run your credit card through, and make a call from 35,000 feet. Might be, hey, I'm in the air, or I'm late for the meeting, the damn plane's late. But whatever, you can make that call. It was really a big piece of how the FBI could figure out as much as we know is what happened aboard Flight 93, because those airphone calls, those 35 calls, left records. We know who made the call, or at least who paid for it, whose credit card it was, where it went, how long it lasted, and really importantly for the FBI, where those people were sitting. Was it row 23, seats ABC, or row 26, seats DEF? So you can see, one, how far back the passengers and crew were pushed once the hijackers took over the plane. They're in the, basically the last 10 or 12 rows of the plane. But also who was sitting next to whom. You can kind of figure out and piece together who was plotting together. So it was a very valuable aspect. And so the vast majority of calls were not on cell phones. And the other one, I always have to be a little careful of this, because I've talked to people, see people out at the memorial, there is one name and one phrase that are forever attached to the story of Flight 93. Todd Beamer and let's roll. You're out there, you hear Todd Beamer, let's roll, Todd Beamer, let's roll, Todd Beamer, let's roll. And a lot of people think that is the essence of the story of Flight 93. Folks, that is not the essence of Flight 93. Todd Beamer was a hero, very definitely was a hero. But he was only one of many heroes aboard Flight 93. I don't even think he was the leader. It's just he's been given this outsized role in the minds of the public. And so I just wanted to figure out how this happened. And some of my books have the message theme of trying to get through myths and legends. How did this happen? Well, there were 3 men on board who called and basically said, we're going to try to take back the plane. But Tom Burnett and Jeremy Glick called their wives. Key point. Beamer did try to place, we have a record, he did try to place a call to his home in Cranberry, New Jersey, to his wife. The call dropped in 1 or 2 seconds, no conversation. He then hit 0 and got an AT&T Verizon operator in Chicago, near Chicago, named Lisa Jefferson. And that is the conversation that goes down in American history. Because, on the night of September 11th, we still didn't know exactly why a plane crashed in Shanksville. We knew that it was part of the hijacking attack, part of the terrorist attack. We didn't know why it crashed there. It wasn't until the next day that stories started to get out that something might have happened on that plane. The passengers may have fought back. So reporters are looking for backup on this, for interviews. Well, the wives of Tom Burnett and Jeremy Glick were not doing interviews on September 12th. They were mourning the deaths of their husbands, the fathers of their small children. They would both write books about it, but this would be months, years down the line. Their stories didn't get out. Lisa Jefferson, by contrast, though traumatized, didn't know Todd Beamer before she picked up the call. So the next day when a reporter's called, she could tell that story, and what a story that was. I remember reading it. This darkest period of my life as an American, and you're so rattled and unnerved by what's going on. And the next day you hear these guys fought back, and this young man said, let's roll, and how inspiring that was. And President Bush invited his wife to the White House, and it ensconced the story as legend. And that's important. We need legends, and Todd Beamer was part of it. But as I said, it's kind of given him, in the minds of the public, an outsized role here. And so I think I'm proud to say, I think if someone who wasn't alive on September 11th read my book, they would come away with the conclusion that Todd Beamer was a hero. He was one of the 5 or 6 guys who did this. He just wasn't the primary hero and probably not the leader. And I think this was very much a group effort. So the story. If you were in the Newark International Airport on the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, and you walked past gate 17 at about 7:30 in the morning, you would have seen 33 regular passengers and 7 crew members getting ready for what they thought was a normal flight to the West Coast. United Airlines, Flight 93, Newark to San Francisco. The manifest was the same as any manifest at any airport today. Businessmen and grandparents and college students flying for the reasons we all travel. Going to a conference, going on vacation, going home. One man had been east for his grandmother's 100th birthday party. One lady had been east for her grandmother's funeral. There were 3 college students traveling, getting in those final trips before classes really start in earnest. And I think many of these people are anonymous to us today, and that's a sad thing. We know Todd Beamer's name. You might know 1 or 2 of the others, but I like, before I really get into the story, to give you a sense of some other of those people who are on the plane, to give you a sense of the every man, every woman sense of this manifest. Now, the plan was for each hijack crew to have 5 men. One hijacker pilot, these men had been in the country for a year basically, attending flight schools in Florida and Arizona, getting their small plane licenses, and then practicing on simulators of bigger planes. And each would then have 4 muscle hijackers, 2 to attack the cockpit, take out the pilot and first officer, and 2 to push the rest of the passengers and crew to the back of the plane. They each had their own assignments. Now here are the Flight 93 hijackers. What do you notice? There are only 4. Al-Qaeda could not get the 5th man, i.e. the 20th hijacker, into the country. 9 men were nominated. 1 made it all the way to Orlando, Florida in August, just a month before this. But a very alert immigration officer turned him back. Didn't speak English, didn't know where he was going, had only a one-way ticket, had no money, lots of red flags. They turned him back. So Al-Qaeda had to go forward with a smaller crew on this plane. So there were only 4. That may have led to another delay in that these guys took longer than they were supposed to attack the cockpit and hijack the plane. There's a cockpit of a 757. The plan, as we know from conspirators who were still down in Guantanamo, from some of the plotters, is that they were supposed to take over the plane within 15 minutes of takeoff. Now, that was probably unrealistic and only happened, in fact, on one of the flights. But the others were all done within 30 minutes. These guys took 46. We don't know why that happened. Now, Ziad Jarrah, the pilot from Lebanon, the hijacker pilot, was wavering a bit at the end. He went to visit his girlfriend. They were worried he might drop out. Did that have an impact? I don't know. Did being down a man have an impact? I don't know. We don't know that. But they took longer than they were supposed to. The plane takes off at 8:42, is not hijacked until 9:28. How do we know that's when the hijack happens? 2 things. One, this was the only flight where both black boxes were recorded. It was the only plane that didn't hit a building. So in the flight data recorder, the National Transportation Safety Board was able to do a video of a simulation of the flight path. And at 9:28, you can see a dramatic dip. It lost altitude all at once. Also, the United pilot or first officer at the time of the attack clicked the microphone, and air traffic control in Cleveland heard a struggle. Mayday, mayday, get out of here, get out of here. This is a public available audio now that's out there. So that's when the fight starts, 9:28. They're pushed to the back of the plane, the rest of the passengers and crew. And at 9:30, only 2 minutes later, the phone calls start. That's when they start to make those calls. They're pushed down. Imagine being pushed on that narrow aisle. And there you can see the airphones, where video screens are today. You can see those phones. They pulled those out. 9:30, the calls started. 12 people aboard this flight made 35 calls on the airphones. Counting the cell phones, 13 overall. And this is how, as much as we know, what we know about the story of Flight 93. With the airphones in particular, the technology wasn't great. So of the 35, 20 of them dropped off almost immediately. But 15 got through. And that's really how we can piece together what happened aboard. And the one thing that was surprising, I'm sure, to the people on board is they thought that they were just reporting they were hijacked. Remember, at this point, the first plane hit the first tower at 8:46. We thought that was an accident. The second plane hits the second tower, that huge fireball, at 9:03. Then we know we're under attack. This is more than a half hour later. The loved ones have been watching on television. The only people in the United States at that point who didn't know we were under terrorist attack were probably the people aboard Flight 93. They think they're the only ones. So the unintended consequence was they got information back. The loved ones are telling them what's going on. 2 planes have hit the World Trade Center. I don't know what that would have seemed like in your mind. We have those images in our mind right now. I don't know what that would have looked like if you had never seen that video, what their images in their minds. It had to be terrifying. Now, in the first 10 minutes, the loved ones who tell us, and these calls weren't recorded. There were 3 voicemail messages, voice machine messages, but calls weren't recorded. We have to go on their testimony. There was no talk right away of taking back the plane. They're bewildered, sharing information, some saying goodbyes. It's not really until the 3rd plane hits the Pentagon that these folks are galvanized. Now, that crash happened at 9:37. So by the time that's reported and it gets to CNN and NBC and Liz Glick and Dina Burnett see it and tell their husbands, it's probably about 9:45 when the people aboard hear that. which means they have about 10 or 12 minutes to plan their attack. Their counterattack started at 9:57. We don't know what that attack was. We don't even know how many took part. But I'm pretty sure from testimony of loved ones and just from studying personalities that these 6 were involved. Upper left, Jeremy Glick, 6'1", 215, former black belt. He's a black belt in judo, former national judo champion at the University of Rochester. Guy you'd certainly want on your side if you're going to be in a fight. Center top row, Tom Burnett, 6'2", 205, former high school quarterback, recruited to play in college, appointed to the Air Force Academy. He chose to go into business, COO of a medical services company, about to be named CEO. Leadership every step of the way in his life. I think he was the leader. Mark Bingham, upper right-hand corner, 6'4", 225, two-time national rugby champion at the University of Cal Berkeley. Was kind of a daredevil, dove off cliffs, ran with the Bulls in Pamplona. One of his rugby teammates said he was like a missile going down the field. Lower left, Todd Beamer, 6 feet, 200, two-sport star at Wheaton College in Illinois, star in baseball and basketball. Center bottom row, Joey Nackey. Now, pause here a little bit because Joey didn't make a call. If 13 people did, that means 27 didn't. We'll never know their stories. We will never know the full story of D-Day because so many men died on those Normandy beaches. We'll never know the full story of Pickett's charge because so many men died making and defending the charge. You know, a lot of people say if I was in this situation, I wouldn't call my loved ones. I wouldn't want to worry them. And that certainly was Joey Nackey's case, his family said. But I can tell you, folks, I hope none of us are ever in this position, but the folks who got the calls, the families who got the calls, they're a little more at peace. They heard from their loved ones. But Joey didn't call his brother, said he would have never worried us. So we don't know his thoughts, but this is what I know about him. He's 5'9", 200 pounds, barrel-chested weightlifter, loud, gruff. His wife said, no one will ever take me down without a fight. He doesn't seem to be the kind of guy who would say, yeah, you guys go ahead and attack the cockpit. I'm going to sit here. You let me know how that goes. I think he was involved. He was up there swinging. And Don Green, we'll get to him in just a second. Now, the counterattack starts at 9:57. How do we know that? A couple of things. 2 ladies were on the phone at that point, a passenger to her mother in New Jersey, a flight attendant to her husband in Florida. Both cut off their calls at 9:57. One said, I've got to go. Everybody's running the first class. Another said, I've got to go. We're going to attack the cockpit. We also, from the cockpit voice recorder, know that Ziad Jarrah, the Lebanese-born pilot in the cockpit, says at 9:57 in Arabic, what's that, a fight? They could hear the commotion going on back as these guys, probably led by Jeremy Glick, the black belt in judo, are taking down those 2 muscle hijackers. Now, they're making some progress going single file, I'm sure, down that narrow aisle. But then Jarrah had a tactic to throw them off. He starts, you can see this on the NTSB animation, he starts to rock the wings, 30 degrees in each direction. Have you ever been on a plane and tried to get up during a little bit of turbulence and tried to go to the bathroom, how difficult it is to get your footing? How about 30 degrees each way with a pilot who doesn't know what they're doing? The cockpit voice recorder, and only the families and one trial jury have ever heard the tape, but the FBI did a very detailed transcript, and I was able to get a copy of it. It talks about loud crashing and banging noises. Luggage had to be flying out of the overhead racks, and dishes, and glasses. It had to be terrifying, stuff flying everywhere. But Jarrah couldn't keep doing that. He had to get to his target, so he had to straighten the plane out, and they regained their momentum and head toward the cockpit. At about 10:01, the plane crashes at 10:03. So they're basically fighting in the air for about 6 minutes. About 10:01, cockpit voice recorder has an English-speaking voice, one of the passengers saying, in the cockpit, if we don't, we'll die. Think of that. In the cockpit, if we don't, we'll die. I always pause here to say, you know, we as Americans have this thing of taking very accurate historic stories, great stories, and building legends and myths on top of them. It's a very American thing to do. We've been doing it since the Revolutionary War. In this case, how many times have you heard the passengers and crew of Flight 93 brought down that plane to save lives? They crashed that plane to save those people in the Capitol. Well, that's what happened. but listen to their own unvarnished testimony. In the cockpit, if we don't, we'll die. To me, that only says one thing. They had an alternative to dying. Don Green, lower right corner, was a licensed pilot. Now, he was only licensed to fly small planes. He couldn't fly a 757 any more than Ziad Jarrah. But he knew aviation. He'd been in the air. He worked for a company. He was executive for a company that supplied airplane parts. He knew the language. Another man on board, Sonny Garcia, earlier in his life had done 8 years of air traffic control for the California Air National Guard. These guys knew aviation. 3 or 4 of us could try to take over a plane, but if we can't fly it, what's the difference? I think what that quote meant is they were trying to get Don Green in the pilot's seat. Was it a long shot? Absolutely. But it's all they had. And on a clear day, which this was, and with instruction every step of the way from air traffic control, he might have had a chance. They never got that opportunity. It all started too late. Now, did they get to the cockpit? We always get that question. We don't know. The FBI was never able to determine it. The plane crashed at such a high speed that the evidence was just destroyed. They couldn't tell. I believe they did. It might be because I want to believe they did, but there are 2 pieces of little circumstantial evidence. One, at that point in the flight, you hear the recorder transcript keeps talking about their voices were very loud voices, and the microphones were in the cockpit. But also, there's an exchange at one point where an English-speaking voice says, "Turn it up," and an Arabic voice says, "Pull it down." Turn it up, pull it down, turn it up, pull it down. To me, that seems like there was a struggle for control. In the final seconds, you can tell in the animation, the steering wheel or yoke turns very hard to the right, and the plane actually turns upside down in midair. Now, why did that happen? We don't know. There are 2 theories. Either the passengers and crew broke into the cockpit and they're fighting for control. Remember, they didn't have knives as weapons. They're fighting for control, and in that fight, the wheel turned and the plane turned. But we also know that the hijackers were instructed in advance that if they couldn't reach their target, they were to crash their planes. It would cause devastation anyway. Muhammad Atta, the overall leader who flew the first plane into the World Trade Center, said if he couldn't reach the Trade Center, he would crash his plane into the streets of New York City. So the hijackers may have been doing it on their own at the very end. But certainly it was at least the pressure of the passengers and crew almost getting there that caused this to happen. At 10:03 and 9 seconds, we hear the last English voice on the tape. A man yells, "No." And at 10:03 and 11 seconds, Flight 93 crashes at 563 miles an hour into an open field in near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, actually in Stony Creek Township. The result was absolute devastation. The theory from where they found the evidence is the front third of the plane sheared off and flew into a grove of hemlock trees that were just beyond the crash site. They found a lot of evidence up in those trees. The bottom 2/3, one FBI official said, accordioned on top of one another and went deep into the ground. This was a reclaimed strip mine, so the ground was a little softer than normal. They found pieces of the plane 35 feet into the ground. That tells you the devastation of the crash. They dug 40 feet just to make sure. Upper left is the only photo taken in the immediate aftermath of the crash. It's from about 1.5 miles away from a lady who was at her kitchen table and didn't see the plane but felt it. She said, "I felt the crash." A lot of people living nearby felt that plane hitting the ground. What would it felt like at 563 miles an hour? Now, we have a difficult time with young people today. They do not understand why we don't have more photos. They don't understand that not only back then, everybody didn't even have a cell phone, but none of our cell phones had cameras in them. So you couldn't take those kinds of photos. They have the middle school tours, the bus tours. They have trouble getting their heads and arms around this stuff. Imagine how Flight 93 and September 11th would have been reported today with the kind of technology and connectivity we have. But this was the only photo in the immediate aftermath that's jet fuel obviously exploded, and that's the smoke and dissipated very quickly. On the right side, that's obviously the crater. From an aerial view, you could see the outlines of the wings, and there are the hemlock trees where they found a lot of the evidence. Upper left, that's about the biggest piece of the plane they found, the piece of the fuselage. It's about this little bit bigger than the size of the hood of the car. Lower right is the flight data recorder, the black box. I learned in this case, black boxes actually aren't black. I don't know why they're called black boxes. They're orange, so you can find them in a crater or in a hole like this in the ground. From that point on, the FBI was there for 2 weeks. From that point on, it really became very much a small town America story, a Somerset County story. The folks, the family members I talked to, they know their experience after the crash in this tragic time was so much different than the people in New York and Washington, D.C. These small town America folks opened their hearts and homes. And even the coroner of Somerset County was a guy named Wally Miller. He was just a local funeral director. He did 120 funerals a year. But they all said he treated them like he was one of their funeral home clients. They called it midnight. People from California called. Wally would answer the phone. They wanted to go to the site. Wally would take them to the site. So he's a hero to them, and the Somerset County people are a hero. It really is a small town America story. And my friends were kind of surprised that there were 7 or 8 chapters in the book after the crash. It's such a detailed story afterward. The FBI investigation, the families coming together, the Somerset County story, and then the building of the memorial. For many years there was a temporary memorial. There you see one example. Locals put up some benches and a fence. And every Sunday night, people would leave items, leave messages, and just tributes to the passengers and crew. Every Sunday night, they would clean off that fence, and by the middle of the next week, it was filled. People would say, "Where are my items?" Well, they cleaned them off every week. They gathered more than 60,000 items over the years. They're all at the Somerset County Historical Society. Some of them are on rotation at what is now the museum, which the memorial opened on the 10-year anniversary, and the Museum Visitor Center actually opened in 2014. So this is the lower end of the memorial. You can see the wall is the wall of names. Each member of the passenger and crew has the name on an individual panel there. You can see some of the flowers that are left. And the mowed path out right before the trees, you see a big boulder. That is marks the approximate site of the crash site. Now, this part of the memorial was donated on the 10th anniversary in 2011. I went out there it was a big weekend, the dedication on Saturday the 10th, and the 10-year anniversary on Sunday the 11th. Saturday the 10th was a big day. There were about 5,000 people there. I had no idea of writing a book back then. I was just interested as a citizen, drove out, and you looked up on stage. There were former President George Bush, former President Bill Clinton, and the sitting vice president at the time, Joe Biden. So now we look back, you had 3 presidents of the United States in this little town near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That told you just how important it was, how much this meant to the country. They all gave great speeches, and I write in my book, which is long before Biden ran for president. I'm writing in 2013. I thought they all gave great speeches. I thought he connected most with the family members because, as we know now, he did a tragedy in his life. His first wife and young daughter were killed in an accident, and I thought he really could connect with the families on that sense of personal loss. And he gave a tribute to the heroes, the 40 heroes who fought back, going back all the way to the start of the country, to Lexington and Concord, and Captain John Parker's quote about the British: "If they mean to have a war, let it start here." And he said that as a tribute to these folks in their first combatants in the War on Terror. I used to end my talk with that quote. I think it was rather dramatic, but then I started thinking more about Gettysburg and my love of Gettysburg and my understanding of Gettysburg and what happened here. And as this group knows, there was a famous Joshua Chamberlain speech in the 1880s when Chamberlain came back to dedicate the 20th Main Monument. And he spoke at the time of why people come to historic sites. And in his case, why they come to battlefields, but to historic sites. What draws them there? And I'll try to get the quote correctly. Chamberlain said, "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass, bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. And reverent men and women from afar, generations who know us not, and we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream. That was very relevant at Gettysburg in the 1880s. It's just as relevant in Somerset County, Pennsylvania in 2022. If you haven't been to the memorial, it's only about 100 miles away from Adams County. I heartily suggest you get there. If you've been there, please come back. There are new displays all the time. It's such a meaningful place. We would love to have you come and visit and pay tribute to the 40 heroes of Flight 93. Thank you for letting me tell their story.
Well, Tom, that's a very powerful story. I want to know, since you were not a professional writer to start with, and you were in the sports field, how did you end up doing a book, your first book ever, on Flight 93?
Question I get a lot, and weirdly the answer is because I was in the sports field. I had been a newspaper writer, but had never written anything to book length. But I happen to be very interested in this story anyway. It's shortly after the 10th anniversary, after they, which I had mentioned there, where they dedicated the memorial. I worked for the Pittsburgh Penguins as VP Communications, and the team got a letter of the families of Flight 93. So they said, "You're the history buff. You're getting this one," because we get all kinds of requests, as you can imagine. And I opened it up, and it was from Gordy Felt, whose brother was on the flight, and he said, "We just dedicated the memorial, and Wally Miller, the local funeral director, who's the coroner, treated us so well that we as the families want to do something for him. And the thing he likes most in life is Pittsburgh Penguins hockey. In fact, he's a season ticket holder. Could you do something to honor him at a game?" And of course we could. So I set everything up, and some of the family members and the state police and Wally came into a game, and we gave him a jersey. And because of that, they invited me out because I told them I was interested in the story early one morning, and they took me out to the memorial, took me out to the actual crash site. The public can only get to about 75 yards. Only the families can go out to the actual crash site. It's their sacred ground. But I went out early. They took me out, and they're telling, "This is where I found this. This is where I found that." And then they showed me that they had, at that point, more than 200 oral histories that local volunteers, much like the local historical society, had done from family members, first responders, police officers, FBI. And they had these stacks. And I said, "You have all this. It's great, but is somebody going to write this?" Nobody had come to him to write it. And the superintendent of the Park Service out there said, "You used to be a newspaper writer. Would you consider doing it?" "Okay, I'll try." It was a rather dramatic first attempt, because you're writing this history. And there were a couple of times, anybody who's a writer out there, you get writer's block. A couple of times I hit the wall. But you're thinking, I wanted to throw my computer into the river. If I don't do this, maybe no one else will. And there was one book about Flight 93 written within the first year, but they didn't know very much then. There have been a couple September 11th books, but nothing else on this flight. So it's still the only one in more than 20 years. So I'm glad I did it. It's kind of a roundabout way, and it's led to 3 other books after that. I tell you, if I don't get that letter from the families, I don't write any of the Gettysburg books, because it got me into it. It's been a fun hobby, but this was obviously the most emotional, and I still feel it when I tell the story or I go back to the memorial.
And now you serve on the board?
I have. I've termed out. You can only be on the board for so many years, but I served a couple of terms on the board, and I think it was, they knew that I was writing a book, and your boards are always looking for different perspectives. And a lot of the early members were from the Shanksville, Somerset County area, so I was from the city, and I was volunteering out there, so I was very happy to do it and help them with some communications and PR, and I'm off the board now, but it'll always be a special place to me. And you volunteer, and I donate all my author's proceeds from the book to the Friends of Flight 93, to the citizens group that supports the memorial. So it'll always be a place that's near and dear to my heart.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.